You see street names every day, but they do much more than help people avoid getting lost. They quietly helped cities see, sort, and control urban life, and most people never notice that power. What looks like a simple sign on a wall is actually part of a much bigger system. Street names feel ordinary now. Most people never ask why cities needed them. But a city without names is harder to organize. It is also harder to control. That is the hidden story here. Street names were never just for directions. They became a quiet tool of power. They made cities easier to read. For most of history, cities were messy. Streets grew without central planning. They curved around walls and markets. They also bent around rivers and homes. Many streets had no fixed identity. People still found places anyway. They used memory and landmarks. They also relied on local knowledge. That system worked in smaller places. It worked when life stayed local. But it had limits. It could not scale well. As cities grew, confusion grew too. More strangers moved through them. Trade became more complex. Government also became more demanding. Mail needed exact destinations. Police needed exact locations too. Tax officials wanted clearer records. Fire response needed speed as well. Vague directions stopped being enough. Bigger cities needed precision. A growing city needed more than roads. It needed a naming system. That is when street names changed. They became official labels. At first, many names were descriptive. They reflected local life. Market Street led to a market. Mill Lane led to a mill. But official naming changed everything. Streets entered administrative records. That sounds minor at first. In reality, it changed urban power. Once a street had a fixed name, it could be recorded again and again. That made it governable. It could appear in tax files. It could also appear in court cases. It could enter maps and census rolls. It could enter police reports too. Now, different institutions could refer to the same place. They could coordinate more easily. That is the real power of naming. It turns space into information, and once space becomes information, it becomes easier to manage. It also becomes easier to control. Before that shift, cities were harder to pin down. They were less legible to authority. A district could be known in general, but exact urban space stayed slippery. That slipperiness mattered. It limited how deeply institutions could act. Street names reduced that uncertainty. They made places repeatable in documents, and repeatable places are easier to govern. That is the hidden leap. Mail is one clear example. Postal systems need consistency. They cannot run forever on local memory. They need stable routes and addresses. Street names made those routes possible. House numbers later made them even sharper. Now the city could identify not just a street, it could identify a precise point. That sounds boring today, but boring systems build modern life. The same thing happened with taxation. Named streets made property easier to record. And recorded property is easier to tax. It is also easier to regulate. A nameless lane resists neat administration. An official address does not. That is how control grows in cities. It expands through small improvements in record keeping. Policing changed too. Crime reports became more precise. Patrols could be organized more clearly. Suspicious patterns could be tracked better. Jurisdictions became easier to define. Urban space became easier to monitor. Street names helped police move faster. They also helped institutions think spatially. This is part of a bigger pattern. States need society to be legible. A government cannot manage what it cannot identify. It first needs names. Then it can map. Then it can record. Then it can govern more deeply. That sequence matters. Street names were one small piece of that machine, but they were a very important piece. They turned movement into routes. They turned routes into records. And records extend administrative reach. That is the deeper logic. There is another layer here. Street names also shape public memory. Who gets remembered in a city is never neutral. That is a power question too. Some streets honor rulers and generals. Others honor saints, poets, or revolutions. And when regimes change, streets often change names too. That tells you a lot. A city is not just being organized. It is also being narrated. Rename a street, and you can rewrite memory. You can do that without moving a single building. You can erase an old regime. You can celebrate a new one. You can signal a new identity, all with one sign on one corner. So street names do two jobs at once. They organize space and shape meaning. One function is practical, the other is symbolic. Together, they make control feel natural. That is why they are so effective. Street names do not feel like power, they feel like convenience. And useful systems are often the strongest systems. People accept them because they solve real problems. Street names did solve real problems. They reduced confusion and improved movement. They helped deliveries and emergency response. They connected maps, property, and administration. All of that is true, but every gain in legibility has a cost. To be easier to find is also to be easier to monitor. That trade-off never fully disappears. To be easier to register is also to be easier to regulate. That is the quiet bargain of modern cities. Modern urban life depends on this system. Utilities depend on it too. Elections use it. Census systems use it as well. Insurance uses it. Digital delivery apps rely on it every day. Ride-sharing also depends on it. So does modern navigation. Typing an address into a phone feels effortless now, but that ease has a long history. It rests on centuries of naming and numbering. It also rests on mapping and bureaucratic standardization. The street sign is only the visible tip. Beneath it sits a much larger machine. And once you notice that machine, the city looks different. It feels more constructed. Street signs stop looking like neutral markers. They start looking like evidence. They show how cities became readable to institutions. That is the transformation. A city stopped being only a lived space. It became a system that power could read. That helped make cities bigger. It also made them more governable. They became more navigable and measurable. They also became more administratively visible. So the next time you see a street sign, pause for a second. It carries more history than it seems. It is not just a helpful label. It is part of a long project of urban control. Behind that sign stand surveyors and map makers. Postal workers and tax offices stand there too. Police systems stand there as well. City halls stand there with them. All of them were trying to solve the same problem. How do you make a complex city understandable? One answer was surprisingly simple. Name the streets. Once streets had names, cities became easier to read. Once cities became easier to read, they became easier to govern. And that is how something so ordinary quietly gave cities more control.